Now we have a huge number of questions coming in. Keep them coming in, 51444 or hashtag VirtualBeefWeek. And I'm just going to address a few of these to our panel of experts. I'm going to batch a few together here, and a number of farmers, I suppose, Frank and Orla in particular, I suppose I'm directing this at. A number of farmers here querying, you know, calves, groups of calves that are showing signs of coughing. You know, calves in some cases that have been dosed maybe a week or 10 days ago, some haven't. You know, what is the, and these are on suckler farms, when you hear that, Frank, coming in as a veterinary practitioner on a call, what's the first thing you think of? Or I suppose, Orla, in terms of, you know, the type of samples, what sort of analysis would we think of looking at here? I'll go to you first, Frank, maybe.
Yeah, well, really you need some laboratory help here to make that differential diagnosis. That's not removing the importance of the clinical exam. For instance, if animals are running at temperatures and they've got, you know, a certain noise in the lungs, you'd suspect an infectious process going on. You mightn't have that with the lungworm. In addition then, we may have to take some blood samples and look at serology, or take some tracheal or bronchial washes and look at if you like, the cells there, and they'll inform us whether they're eosinophils or whether they're, you know, bacterial infection or whatever. Unfortunately, sometimes we waste the opportunity of post-mortem. Animals die, and it's great to get an early post-mortem, and it often can prevent further losses down the road. So that'll be my key point there. Get a good differential diagnosis, get to the bottom of the problem, and it'll give you confidence going on as to what way to treat. Okay, and Orla, in terms of the year we've had, if you received a query such as that, where would you start, and what would you suspect, I suppose?
Yeah, so I suppose as Frank mentioned, you know, there's a number of different options. Obviously, you know, one of the ones we'd be most concerned about in the parasitology lab is, of course, lungworm. And we do perform Behrman tests for lungworm. I suppose the one thing you have to be aware of with the diagnostic tests in the laboratory, that you are looking at adult worms. In order to see a positive test on a fecal sample, that means the presence of adult worms that are laying eggs, and then the larvae are passing out in the dung, the lungworm larvae. So it may be a negative test is not definitive that no lungworm is present. It is possibly this pre-patent period before they're laying the eggs. It's the larval stage of the parasite, and that can still do damage. So as Frank said, it's part of a much bigger picture.
Okay, so again, communication and engagement with your veterinary practitioner.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And just to pick up on that then, we have the option now with lungworm perhaps to use a lungworm vaccine.
Yes.
So that has re-emerged. Traditionally it was one that was used in the past, and now it's available again. There's certain terms and conditions to using it, but if it's a problem in your farm persistently, it's one that you could look at.
Okay, thank you, Frank. A number of questions here for you, David, in relation to the synchronization program and the discussion that we had earlier on. A number of people querying about subsequent fertility of cows. You know, the cows that have been subjected to these protocols, is there any effect or any consequential impacts on subsequent breeding and fertility?
Yes, that's an assertion, Paul, that comes up from time to time, maybe at discussion groups and other meetings. You know, and I think we've ample evidence now, both within our own, I suppose, observations and also worldwide, you know, to show that there's absolutely no, I suppose, effect or latent or follow-on effect of these interventions, which are essentially all you're doing, we'll say, is briefly interrupting the cow's normal cycle. You know, using, you know, drugs or veterinary medicines, we'll say, that are very, very similar to the cow's own hormones. So essentially, you know, there are studies that we can, you know, that we can cite from South America, where, you know, there's 10 years data with tens of thousands of cows that have been synchronized and heifers that have been synchronized year on year, and you know, looking at the conception rates on those herds, you know, they're very, very acceptable at 60 to 65%.
Okay, so no concerns for subsequent fertility
no.
on that basis. Another one here, just in relation to synchronization programs and protocols. Cost versus benefit. So obviously these are, you know, there's additional handling costs and material costs here versus the benefit. Have you looked at that, or where are the figures on that?
Yeah, we've looked at them. I suppose we've looked at, we'll say, traditional AI versus, we'll say, synchronized or timed AI versus natural service. And when you take, I suppose, the various costs and all, you know, so obviously we'll say you have the drug costs, we'll say, and involved in, and facilities obviously as well, we'll say, in terms of the AI usage. And then in terms of the natural service sire, you have the purchase cost, we'll say, and again, it's probably the most single expensive animal on the herd. But not alone that, but the maintenance of that animal subsequently. And in most cases, in Irish herds, quite small, and many that are less than 20 cows, the actual cost per calf produced over 3 to 4 years for that bull, is quite high.
Yeah.
So when you take the balance, across the board in synchronization or timed AI versus natural service, it's very, very similar, in terms of the overall cost per calf produced. But the actual value of those calves from the AI are much, much greater. And again, data from the States and elsewhere would support that.
Of course, and we've seen Artie Bert, Niall O'Mara and the Beef Talk earlier today talking about the benefits of AI in producing, a better quality calf, if you like. He's more selection in terms of replacements as well as terminal sires and so on.
Absolutely.
So really important point that. There's a number of questions coming in relation to trace elements, some asking about iodine, some about selenium, some about copper here. I suppose if we batch them all together, and I can address this, I suppose, to you, David, and maybe Frank as well. As part of your study, David, did you look at trace elements, and were there any relationship or implications of trace element if there was a deficiency in reproductive performance?
Yes, I suppose as part of that bigger project with cow fertility on-farm work that I cited earlier, the synchronization was one part of it, but equally, Paul, we had another 200 herds across, the 32 counties on the island of Ireland, because again it was in collaboration with the Agri-Science and Bio-Science Institute in Northern Ireland. And we found that, I suppose, there was huge variation in terms of, both within herds and across herds in the blood concentrations of the main trace elements. And principally we looked at iodine, selenium and copper. About 15% of cows in herds were below the, I suppose, recommended levels for copper, but 80% of cows were below the recommended levels for both selenium and iodine. Okay. Now, that was across 6,000 cows, as I say, on 200 herds. However, when we looked at subsequent fertility in those herds, we didn't really see, any indication of poor fertility across that huge range. So while in certain herds it may well be an issue, but overall as a contributor to, I suppose, infertility in herds, it's probably at the lower end of the spectrum.
Okay, so is it an issue related to thresholds that maybe not right, or do these deficiencies have impact elsewhere in the system?
I think there's, obviously the study and most, I suppose, interventions or measurements on farm will be based on blood or systemic levels. So again, not always, particularly copper, a really accurate indicator of the copper status. And there is, I suppose, some compensatory mechanisms there within the animal to compensate. Okay. But certainly it's often cited, as, when there's an infertility issue, that it's either potentially pathogen-based or indeed trace elements. Okay. But certainly our work for either would suggest, that while in isolated cases, and again, obviously in conjunction with the farmer's veterinary surgeon, they need to be followed up upon. But in the greater scheme of things, other issues such as nutrition in particular, would have a much, much greater impact on herd fertility.
Okay, and I turn to you, Frank O'Sullivan. I suppose David mentioned the importance of engaging again with the veterinary surgeon and your veterinary practitioner. I suppose, in your experience, trace element deficiency, is it an issue, or is it only a real serious issue when you get very low levels, or are other issues much more important?
Yeah, we tend to take the overall, if you like, helicopter picture. So in preparing a herd for good fertility, we probably look at 4 key areas. One would be the infectious disease, lepto, BVD. Make sure they're in place. Make sure you have programs in place for those. Secondly, you would have management of AI, good heat detection, good AI technique, fertile bulls. Thirdly, the genetics, and AI comes into that. And fourthly, then nutrition. Now, there's the macronutrition in terms of the body condition score at the correct times, not too fat, not too thin, but also you have the micronutrition, such as the copper, iodine, selenium story. Now, sometimes we can use these, a bit like David said, as a scapegoat or a golden nugget to blame everything on or solve everything. So I would counsel against that. However, copper in particular in our area is a problem because it's molybdenum toxic. Molybdenum is tying up the copper and we end up with a secondary copper deficiency. Now that mainly manifests itself in the young calf actually, in terms of his growth and so on. Again, selenium is not the same all over the country. there's a vein of land here in Teagasc here, and you go to the seaside over to Bettystown, and it's selenium toxic in the last couple of years. So we have to be careful about supplementing minerals for the sake of it. Iodine then, similarly, just, probably a little bit deficient, needs supplementing, but, so again, there's not one size fits all. It's a little bit bespoke, but it's worth considering as part of the overall 4 pillars for good fertility.
Thank you, Frank. Thank you, David. Thank you, Orla. So we're approaching the hour mark, so I want to draw this broadcast to a close. I found it tremendously informative. I hope you at home have found it informative as well. This brings to a close our first day of the Teagasc Virtual Beef Week, sponsored by FBD Trust. Today we focused on all things to do with suckler beef systems. I want to thank a few people as I draw this to a close. I want to thank our production team here at Teagasc Grange in our studios, Declan McCardle, Marcin DeBarra and all their colleagues. I also want to thank our panel members, Professor David Kenny, Frank O'Sullivan and Dr. Orla Keane. I suppose we've had a huge amount of content throughout the day, ranging from all of the content on social media, our beef talk at 12 midday, and indeed this evening here at Live at Grange. The organisers for this day should take a lot of credit for this, Aidan Murray and David Kenny. Finally, I would invite you to join us again tomorrow. Tomorrow is our second day of the Virtual Beef Week, and we're focusing on dairy calf-to-beef systems. Our social media output will start early tomorrow morning, so please keep an eye on all your social media platforms. Join us again tomorrow at 12 midday for Beef Talk and at 7 p.m. for Live at Grange. But for tonight, good night from Grange.